Welcome to the Lost Sci-Fi Story channel. If you're ready, let's begin today's story.
The Meridian Shared Archive Facility had been built at the edge of a contested stellar boundary, which was a diplomatic way of saying that nobody had wanted it anywhere near their actual territory. And the compromise location had been selected by a joint committee that had spent 11 months in negotiation and approximately 40 minutes thinking about whether the site had adequate parking. It did not. The facility itself was a long, low structure of pale composite material that caught the light of a distant binary system in a way that the architects had described in their proposal as symbolically resonant, and that most of the people who worked inside it described as a bit much before coffee. Half the building ran cooler than the other half, a concession to Ethan biological preference that the human staff had accepted with the grudging professionalism of people who had been issued very good sweaters. The cafeteria rotated menus on alternating days. The hallways were precisely wide enough for two researchers of different species to pass without accidental contact, a dimension that appeared in the original schematics under the heading Comfort and Safety, and that everyone tacitly understood also meant we have thought carefully about what happens when someone reaches for a doorknob at the same time as someone else, and we have decided to make it architecturally impossible. Dr. Elias Voss had arrived 14 months ago with 3 hard-case translation matrices, a copy of a foundational linguistics text so heavily annotated that the margins had begun to annotate each other, and a professional reputation assembled from years of patient, methodical work of the kind that earned deep respect from other linguists and complete incomprehension from everyone at dinner parties. He had been assigned to the Preconvergence Restoration Project, which was the sort of title that sounded, in grant applications, like the frontier of human-ethan intellectual cooperation, and which was, in daily practice, the academic equivalent of being handed a box of wet ash and asked to reconstruct the newspaper. The texts were fragments. The grammar was contested. 3 of the phonemes had no established sound value and were currently represented in the shared database by colored squares that a previous researcher had selected apparently at random and that everyone had since become too accustomed to change. Elias had looked at the project scope on his first morning, poured himself a coffee, looked at it again, and made the practical decision to find it interesting, which was a skill he had developed early in his career and which had served him better than almost anything else. His research partner had arrived 3 weeks after him, which had given him just enough time to develop a working routine that she would dismantle with quiet efficiency and no apparent awareness that she was doing it. Her name was Sail Vora. She was Ethan. She was tall and composed and moved through the archive with the unhurried precision of someone who had never once in her life been late to anything and found the concept mildly baffling. Her hair was dark and moved on occasion, with a subtle independence that had nothing to do with the facility's air circulation system, and which she had explained when he'd asked, carefully, professionally, in the tone of a man asking about a colleague's entirely normal biological characteristic, was vestigial emotional signaling, rendered in the flat voice of someone describing an embarrassing family heirloom they were legally required to keep. Her eyes shifted between amber and pale gold depending on the light, and possibly her mood, and structurally contained a second inner ring of pigmentation that contracted independently, giving her gaze the layered quality of someone looking at you while simultaneously cross-referencing something in an internal filing system. Along her collarbones and the outer edges of her forearms, faint bioluminescent tracery ran in patterns that corresponded, Elias had learned from a footnote in a xenobiology orientation document, to something roughly equivalent to an involuntary emotional display, which was the biological version of a feature nobody would have designed on purpose. She had 4 fingers on each hand, each slightly longer than the human equivalent, and she held her stylus with the casual authority of someone who had stopped thinking about how to hold things approximately 2,000 years before his civilization had discovered writing. Their first meeting had been professionally cordial. He had extended his hand. She had looked at it for one full second, not with confusion. She knew what a handshake was, with the brief evaluating pause of someone deciding whether to adopt a local custom or produce a better one. She had shaken his hand, cool and firm and precisely long enough, and then said, in standard that was flawless and only faintly tonal in the way that marks a language learned rather than grown up in, "I have reviewed your published work on preconvergence phonological drift. Your third chapter was very good." A pause. The second chapter was also acceptable. Elias had decided on the spot that he liked her enormously, put that decision in a professional folder, labeled the folder something responsible, and placed it somewhere he planned never to open. The work made this easier, because the work was genuinely consuming. The preconvergence texts were fragments of a civilization that had achieved written language, early spaceflight, and what appeared to be a substantial tradition of epic poetry, and had then vanished without leaving behind an explanation that satisfied anyone, which was, Elias had noted in a paper that had made him briefly notorious in a small and passionate academic community, very on brand for civilizations that wrote epic poetry. He worked on phonological reconstruction. Sale worked on syntactic deep structure. Their methods were different enough to complement each other and similar enough to argue about, which they did, across a shared desk arrangement that had been described by facilities management as temporary, and that had, by the end of month 2, become a permanent and unspoken fact of their working life. By month 3, their silences were comfortable. By month 6, he had learned that she took her mineral tea at a very specific temperature that the facility's dispenser could not quite achieve, and that she had resolved this problem by bringing her own sealed vessel, and that the vessel, which she had once allowed him to smell in a moment of either collegiality or experiment, produced an experience he had recorded in his private journal as standing inside a thunderstorm that has arrived at a considered opinion. She had learned that he required exactly 1 cup of coffee before he was capable of discussing anything more abstract than the weather, and that this window closed rapidly, and she had, without comment, begun timing her most structurally complex theoretical proposals for minute 7. He had found this out by accident. He had not mentioned it. Some things are more interesting when they remain in the category of things you notice but don't say, which is a category that, between the two of them, had been growing for quite some time. 14 months of collaborative research produces, among other things, a very specific and largely undocumented category of knowledge about another person. Not the kind of knowledge you acquire through conversation or deliberate attention, but the kind that accumulates the way sediment does slowly, without announcement, until one day you realize the landscape has changed, and you cannot identify the exact moment it happened. Elias Voss was, by training and temperament, a careful man. He had not been careful enough. He knew, for instance, that Sale's bioluminescent tracery brightened by a measurable degree when she encountered a translation problem she found genuinely interesting, and dimmed to near invisibility when she was bored, which in 14 months had happened exactly twice. The first time was during a mandatory facility-wide safety briefing, delivered by a man who had apparently written the presentation during a personal crisis, and had not revised it since. The second was when a visiting scholar had spent the better part of an hour explaining a theory of syntactic recursion in preconvergence texts that Sale had, Elias later verified with quiet satisfaction, published a more complete and more elegant version of 7 years prior. She had said nothing. She had sat with her hands folded and her expression composed and her collarbones doing the entire work of communicating her opinion. Elias had looked very hard at the ceiling. When he looked back down, Sale had also been looking at the ceiling, and they had both returned to their screens within the same half-second, with the synchronized discipline of two people who have decided, simultaneously and without discussion, that the professional option is to pretend that particular moment of shared private feeling had not occurred. It had occurred. They both knew it had occurred. The visiting scholar had left the next morning never knowing how much structural work a pair of ceilings had done on his behalf. He also knew, and this was the kind of knowledge that lived in a different folder entirely, that she read physical text by tracing the lines with the tip of one finger, hovering a centimeter above the surface rather than touching it. An Ethan practice she had explained once, briefly, as a remnant of ancestral reading methods that involved slight electromagnetic sensitivity in the fingertips, and which she had retained because, she said, using the compressed understatement that was her natural register, it helps. What she had not explained, and what Elias had never asked, was whether she was aware that watching her do this was the most distracting thing that had ever happened to him in a professional context, including the time a small atmospheric drone had flown directly into his office window mid-lecture, and the students had spent the next 10 minutes debating whether it had done so intentionally. He had developed, in response to this problem, a system he thought of privately as the protocol, which involved identifying an alternative focal point whenever she began reading physical text, and committing to it with the focused intention of a man who is absolutely, completely, not watching his research partner trace lines of a dead civilization's poetry with one slow finger, while her inner irises contract to their most precise configuration. The protocol had become, over time, increasingly elaborate and increasingly unconvincing, and he suspected that somewhere in the deep archive of things Sale noticed but did not mention, the protocol was already catalogued. For her part, she had developed habits around him that he was filing carefully under ambiguous professional warmth, a category he had created specifically, because the alternative categories were ones he wasn't prepared to open. Around month 8, she had begun bringing a second sealed vessel of mineral tea on late-night sessions, setting it on his side of the desk without comment, without eye contact, without any of the social scaffolding that would have required either of them to acknowledge what she was doing. He had accepted it without comment. The tea tasted, to his entirely human palate, like drinking a cloud that had recently made several important decisions, and he drank it every time, and she refilled it without being asked. And the whole arrangement existed in a comfortable and mutually maintained silence that both of them were apparently willing to sustain indefinitely, like two astronomers who have both identified the same star and are waiting to see who charts it first. Dr. Petrov, the facility's chronobiologist and the closest thing Elias had to a friend within reasonable walking distance, had offered his unsolicited assessment of the situation over lunch approximately 6 weeks prior. Petrov was a compact, practical man whose scientific specialty involved measuring time at scales that made human social difficulties seem extremely brief, and who had consequently developed a perspective on interpersonal problems that was either very wise or entirely without mercy, depending on the day. He had watched Elias stare at the cafeteria wall for 40 seconds and then said, without preamble, "You are a linguist, Voss. Your entire professional identity is built on the idea that communication between different species is not only possible but necessary and good." Elias had said that was a reasonable summary. Petrov had picked up his fork. And yet, Elias had explained with great dignity that the situation was considerably more complex than Petrov was representing it. Petrov had eaten his lunch with the expression of a man who studies the deep structure of time and finds individual human timelines very small. The late-night sessions had increased in frequency as the second phase of the project intensified. The archive changed after 10 in the evening in a way that had nothing to do with the automatic lighting shift, though the automatic lighting shift was also significant. The overheads dimmed on a facility-wide timer, leaving only the desk lamps and the pale blue glow of the shared display screens. And in that quality of light, the archive became a different kind of space. Quieter, more itself. The low professional hum of other researchers disappeared, replaced by the ventilation system's ambient presence and the occasional soft sound of the perimeter sensors running their automated checks outside the narrow high windows. In that light, Sale's bioluminescent tracery became more visible without becoming more dramatic. Present the way, some things are more fully themselves in the absence of competing brightness. He had a theory, which he had not tested and would not test, because testing it would have required asking a question that lived on the wrong side of a professional line he was still technically committed to respecting, that her patterns had been running at a consistently elevated brightness during these sessions for the past several weeks. Not dramatically, not in any way that could be cited as evidence of anything, in any forum by any reasonable observer. Just warmer, more present, running at a frequency that his completely objective and scientifically disinterested attention had noted and filed and returned to, repeatedly, the way a tongue returns to a new tooth. He understood, in a situation that was either very straightforward or very complicated, and the difference between those two possibilities was a conversation that neither of them had yet been willing to start. This was, he also understood, somewhat absurd. They had spent 14 months reconstructing the grammar of a language spoken by a civilization that no longer existed, using fragments and inference, and the patient collaborative work of two people who trusted each other's minds completely. And he had not yet managed to construct a single sentence about the considerably more immediate and grammatically simple subject of his own feelings. Petrov, if told this, would have said something brief and accurate that Elias would have found irritating. He had for this reason stopped telling Petrov things. The texts, meanwhile, waited. Section 12 waited. The dead civilizations love poetry, waited with the patient indifference of things that have already survived 800 years, and can afford to give two researchers a little more time to arrive at what the evidence was already suggesting. The night it happened was a Thursday, which Elias felt was cosmically unambitious of the universe. Not a significant date, not an anniversary of anything. The facility's external atmospheric sensors had spent the afternoon registering a minor ionic disturbance in the boundary region. The kind of low-level stellar, whether that made the instruments hum at a slightly different pitch, and caused the archive's older display screens to develop an occasional flicker that facilities management had investigated twice and attributed, in their written report, to ambient field variance, which was the technical equivalent of shrugging. The disturbance had passed by early evening. The screens had settled. The ventilation system was producing its customary late-night sound, somewhere between a sigh and a considered observation. Everything was, by any measurable standard, completely ordinary. Elias would think about this later, the specific ordinariness of the night, the way nothing about it had announced itself, and find it either comforting or unsettling, depending on what time of day he was thinking about it. They had been in the archive since 7. It was now approaching 11, and Section 12 of the third corpus was open on both their screens in the familiar shared document format that marked their late sessions, each of them working in their own column with comments threaded between, a dialogue in the margins that had, over 14 months, developed its own rhythm and its own private shorthand. Sale had flagged a passage 3 hours ago that she believed represented a grammatical pivot point in the text, a shift in register that she thought indicated not a change of authorship, as two previous research teams had argued, but a deliberate rhetorical move. The ancient equivalent, she had written in a comment, of a speaker suddenly lowering their voice. Elias had read this and written back, in the comment thread, that the phonological evidence supported her reading, but that he wanted to check the stress distribution in the preceding stanza before committing. She had replied after a pause that he'd registered without looking up from his own screen. The stress distribution will support it, but check if it helps you. He had checked. It had supported it. He had written noted in the comment thread and chosen not to examine why she had known before he did. The passage they were currently working through was, They had both acknowledged with careful academic neutrality at the beginning of the session, and had not mentioned since, almost certainly a love poem, or the closest functional equivalent in a civilization whose emotional vocabulary operated on different structural principles than either standard or Ethan. The word at the center of the passage, the one that had defeated the previous teams, and that Sale had spent the last 3 weeks rebuilding from phonological residue and syntactic context, appeared to mean something in the range of longing, but not quite longing. Closer, she had proposed in a document comment that Elias had read 4 times and responded to professionally on the first reading. To the specific awareness of a feeling you have been pretending, unsuccessfully, is something else. He had typed back, after a pause he hoped was not as long as it felt, strong reading. The morphology is consistent. Then he had looked at the ceiling for a moment for entirely structural reasons and returned to his screen. Dr. Petrov had sent him a message at 9:15 that read, in its entirety, still at the archive. Elias had replied, working. Petrov had sent back a single punctuation mark, a period, standing alone, doing considerable communicative work, and Elias had put his communicator face down on the desk with the quiet dignity of a man declining to engage. The archive was fully empty by 10. The overhead lights had dimmed to their automatic evening level, and the desk lamps held their small, warm territories against the blue glow of the screens. Sale's second sealed vessel of mineral tea sat on his side of the desk, refilled once without comment sometime around 9. He was on his second cup. It still tasted like a cloud that had arrived at its opinions through careful reasoning, and he drank it with the grateful sincerity of someone who had stopped questioning the gesture that delivered it and simply accepted that it was one of the fixed points of his working life now, along with the sound the archive door made when it sealed at night, and the way Sale always placed her stylus parallel to the edge of the desk when she was done using it. Precisely parallel, with a consistency that suggested either deep personal habit or access to a very small internal ruler. He was working through the stress analysis of the preceding stanza when he became aware, without being able to identify the exact moment it happened, that the quality of silence on her side of the desk had changed. Not loudly, not suddenly. The way a room changes when someone in it has stopped doing one thing and begun doing something else entirely. He did not look up immediately. He was a man who had spent 14 months developing an impressive range of reasons not to look up at particular moments, and he deployed one now, finishing the notation he was working on with the focused attention of someone who is absolutely not aware that they are being looked at. Then he looked up, because not looking up had become, in the space of approximately 4 seconds, completely untenable. She had set down her stylus. She had turned toward him, fully, in the way you turn toward something when you have stopped being willing to turn away from it, and she was looking at him with an expression he did not have a catalog entry for. He had 14 months of her expressions on file, focused, skeptical, quietly amused, faintly appalled, and once, during a particularly unreasonable budget meeting, something that his notes had described as diplomatically homicidal, but this one was new. Her bioluminescent tracery, which he was not looking at and was entirely aware of, had shifted into a warm register he associated with no specific previous context. Her inner irises were still. Her hair was still. Everything about her was very still in the way of something that has been in motion for a long time and has just chosen to stop. She leaned toward him, not dramatically, not as a performance of anything, with the quiet, committed quality of someone who has finished deliberating and is now simply doing the thing the deliberation concluded with. Close enough that the ambient noise of the ventilation dropped out of his attention. Close enough that the distance between their desks, which had organized so much of his interior life for so long, ceased to function as the thing it had been. She was close enough that when she spoke, It was in the register of something said for one person only, and she spoke not in standard, which they had used between them every working day for 14 months, but in Ethan, her first language, the one she had told him once, in the context of a theoretical discussion he had thought about many times since, that she used when standard felt like a wall. 7 words in Ethan, 4 in direct translation. She asked, "Am I the only one who feels this?" The archive was very quiet. The perimeter lights swept through the high windows. Elias Voss, who had spent his entire adult life studying how meaning moves between beings who do not share a native framework, sat in complete silence and found that every word he had was gone. The thing about being a linguist, Elias thought in the silence that followed her question, is that you are never simply silent. Silence, for a linguist, is not the absence of communication, but a communicative act with its own grammar, its own duration, its own inflectional weight. And the silence he was currently producing was saying several things at once, none of them particularly coherent. And he was aware of this with the specific and unhelpful clarity that his brain reserved for moments when he needed it least. He was also aware that 4 seconds had passed. He knew this because the perimeter lights had completed exactly 1/5 of their sweep through the high windows, and he had apparently become, in the absence of language, a man who measures time by automated lighting systems, which was not a development he had anticipated for himself at this stage of his career. She had not moved. That was the thing that reached him most completely. She had asked the question and she had stayed in it, close enough that the warmth of the desk lamp caught the angles of her face, close enough that her bioluminescent tracery was running its warm amber register in his peripheral vision, like a frequency he had finally tuned into after a long time spent pretending the signal wasn't there. She was holding the question open for him with the patient, present quality of someone who has decided that whatever the answer is, she would rather have it than spend another day not knowing. And there was more courage in that stillness than anything Elias had managed to produce in 14 months of very sophisticated avoidance. He said in Ethan, imperfect, accented, built from professional necessity, and a quieter motivation he had been filing under professional necessity for considerably too long, "No, you are not." His pronunciation of the penultimate word landed between the modern form and an archaic regional variant that technically shifted the meaning from only toward something closer to uniquely, a distinction that carried, in classical Ethan literature, a somewhat more emphatic connotation. Sale's inner irises contracted by a fraction. Then she said, in standard, with the precise composure of someone making a very small and very deliberate correction, "You used the archaic inflection." Elias said, "I know." A pause. Was it wrong? She considered this with the brief, serious attention she brought to translation problems that had more than one defensible answer. "No," she said, "it was, in fact, more accurate." He said, "Then I'll keep it." And something in the quality of her stillness shifted. Not dramatically. Nothing between them had ever operated dramatically. They were two people who had conducted an entire emotional history in the margins of a shared document, but shifted the way a question shifts when it receives the answer it was built around, as though a structure that had been held carefully at tension was now, simply, what it was. The ventilation system chose this moment to produce a sound it had never previously made, a sustained metallic commentary that the maintenance logs would later describe as thermal expansion in duct segment 4, and that Elias would always privately think of as the building's opinion. They both looked at the ceiling with identical expressions. Sale looked back down first, and there was something in her face that he had no existing catalog entry for, a combination of warmth and the particular Ethan quality he had come to understand was not blankness but complete presence. And he thought, with the part of his brain that never entirely stopped working even when all the other parts were occupied, that he was going to need more catalog entries. He was very willing to develop them. She picked up her stylus. He picked up his. Section 12 was still open on both their screens, the dead civilization's central passage glowing with its patient 800-year indifference to the timeline of the two researchers assigned to it. Sale looked at the passage for a moment, at the word they had been circling for weeks, the one that meant something in the range of a feeling you have been pretending, unsuccessfully, is something else, and she said, "I want to revise the translation." Elias looked at the screen. He looked at her. He said, "What would you change it to?" She held her stylus above the display in the way she did when she was finding the right word rather than the first one. "The previous reading emphasized the concealment," she said. "I think the emotional center of the word is actually the moment of stopping, the moment you stop pretending." He reached across, highlighted the existing entry and said, "What's the new translation?" She said, without hesitation, the relief of finally calling something by its name. He typed it. They both read it on the screen. He said, "The morphology supports it completely. I don't know why the previous teams missed it." Sale said, in the tone of someone delivering a forensic conclusion, "The previous teams were not in the right position to understand what the word was describing." Elias thought about this for a moment. He said, "That's a kind way of putting it." She said, "I was not trying to be kind, I was being precise." He said, "I know, that's why it works." They stayed until close to 3 in the morning, working through the remainder of Section 12, with the focused, unhurried rhythm that had always been the best thing about how they worked together, and which now had a different quality beneath it. Not louder, not more dramatic, but present the way a new frequency is present once you've learned to hear it. At some point, Elias sent Petrov a message that said only "still working," and Petrov replied with 2 words, "Of course." And then, after a pause that suggested he had reconsidered, added, "Good." Elias put his communicator away and did not examine how much that cost Petrov to send, because some things are better accepted without too much analysis, which was, he reflected, a conclusion he had arrived at roughly 3 hours late but had arrived at nonetheless. When they finally shut down the screens and gathered their things, the archive had the particular quality of a space that has witnessed something it will not mention. The texts were sealed. The shared document was saved. Section 12 marked complete for the first time in 2 years, the revised translation sitting in its field with the quiet confidence of a reading that had been waiting to be found. They walked to the corridor junction where their quarters diverged, and at the junction Sale stopped and turned and said, in Ethan, something short. His vocabulary, imperfect and improving, caught it without difficulty. "Tomorrow. We continue." He said it back. Her bioluminescent tracery, warm amber in the dim corridor light, ran its steady frequency along her collarbones, and her hair moved with its small private opinion, and she turned and walked to her quarters with the unhurried composure of someone who has said exactly what she meant and requires nothing more from the moment. He stood at the junction for a few seconds after she had gone, which was something the old version of him,